Thank you to PARCC for this opportunity to speak. Thank you for Professor Gerard for inviting me, and Oscar for arranging everything, for being here, and all of you for taking time out of your day to come and listen. So how we'll break it up, I'm going to go through my presentation and try to contextualize everything as best as I can, and then kind of give Nico the floor to discuss what's been happening lately. So let's begin. So just to contextualize my work and who I am, I'm a photographer. I've been making images for the most of my life around different topics and issues. I didn't have any special interest going into this project. I chose to go to Colombia because Nico was working there and had been constantly inviting me down, saying, you know, there's a lot happening. You need to come and see what's here. I've worked in Kyrgyzstan and Central Asia. This is a series on agriculture in Japan. These are blind masseuses in South Sudan. After undergrad, this is the Hmong community in Portland. I'm really interested in identity and how people form kind of notions and perceptions of self and how that relates to kind of a greater social and economic environment. This is in the Deep South in Alabama. This is in Portland. I think environmental issues are one of the greatest issues facing us now. So we're talking about Colombia. So has everyone here heard about Colombia? We're not just here for pizza. It's excellent. So it's right there in the northwestern part of South America. Colombia specifically, the area that we're going to be talking about, Ituango, is right here in Antioquia. It's the northern edge of the Andes and predominantly mountainous. Ituango has been difficult to get to in the past, but the soon-to-be largest hydroelectric dam in Colombia is being built, and because of that, roads have been created that have increased access into these areas in the last 6 to 7 years. So what is the Colombian? I'm not sure if this is the right presentation. Was it presentation two?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you want to back up?
No. So this is great. It'll be fine. I think it's all right. So the Colombian Civil War, it's been, I believe, almost 5 decades long, long and bloody. Civilians have really borne the brunt of the majority of the conflict. It's a kaleidoscopic conflict featuring multiple actors with multiple interests. The structural issues behind the conflict come from a lack of development in rural areas and differences in perception coming from that. It involves all these factors: weak government. There's one of the largest internally displaced populations in the world. We'll touch on all of these as we go forward. So a general timeline to give you guys some context about the conflict. We're going to start all the way back in 1948 and run through this in about 5 minutes. So Gaitán was the liberal mayor of Bogota in 1948. Prior to this time, Colombia had been there had been wide inequality within the country. Gaitán was seen as a beacon of hope amongst rural communities to have representation within their government. His assassination in 1948, as he was in the lead up to the elections, led to a period called the Violencia. Essentially, during this time, there was widespread killing and torture and intimidation on the basis of political ideology. Following that, power was consolidated in the National Assembly in 1958. It was a power-sharing agreement between the conservative and the liberal parties. So basically, 1958 to 1978, these two parties would oscillate between power. It was an exclusive power-sharing agreement, so no other political party could participate at that time. In the 60s, in the context of this widespread inequality, there was an accelerated economic development program in the country. During this time, farms were consolidated to the point where in 1971, 70% of the farmland was owned by 5.7% of the population. During this time, large landowners would hire private militias who would go out and essentially remove longer-term residents, peasant farmers, from their property and consolidate that within their holdings. Urban migration increased as rural landowners were forced off of their property. So we're just going to go really fast through these. I apologize. So again, National Front. So moving through this, so FARC was essentially created in 1964. There's a small group in Marquetal. And go ahead. Yes.
It was a small enclave that made up by farmers that wanted to basically build like a reserve, like a farmer's reserve, like independent from the government, from a corrupt government, from an oligarchic government. And the military dictator at the time didn't like that, and he launched a military assault against this enclave. And so the residents of that enclave then fled to the mountains, and that's how it works.
So one of the unintentional byproducts of the National Assembly, there were 8,000 to 10,000 members in the Communist Party at the time, and so they consolidated in these kind of peasant enclaves where they had their parallel structure of governance outside of the scope of the urban space. So that's one of those enclaves that Nick was talking about. So essentially it was low-level conflict through the 60s and 80s. In 1984, there's the Uribe Agreement, which was a peace treaty that transitioned FARC into a political party, the Union Patriotica, Patriotic Union. That was created in 1985. This was their first transition into political power. By 1988, 200 to 500 members had been assassinated. By 1989, I believe some estimates have it up to 5,000, others have it around 2,000 had been assassinated. In the 1990 elections, 70% of all presidential candidates were murdered, and all center-right candidates, or all left-of-center candidates were murdered. So with that, the violence reemerged. And the United States provided support in the form of Plan Colombia in 2000. It was $9 billion that essentially went to combat the drug trade and drug trafficking, and that primarily went to the military, and that was spent on helicopter gunships and precision missiles, which have given strategic advantage to the government in recent years. Just keep continuing. So, Colombian Civil War, 220,000 people have died as a result. Many millions have been displaced, thousands of kidnappings, drug trafficking. So FARC, as an organization, all actors in this conflict have done tremendous damage to the communities from which they come. I'm not saying, as we go through this, it's really important to note that like all sides have been victimized and all sides have gone through intense trauma. FARC in 1999, I think it was the height of kidnapping, it was 3,000 people per year had been kidnapped. There was a huge no mosque campaign where people marched through the city streets demanding an end to the war. Bombings, drug trafficking, etc. At the same time though, and perhaps one of the less reported on more insidious factions in this conflict are the paramilitary groups, which we've seen a reemergence of in the recent months and years. There's many different forces. Primarily now it's the AGC, which was formed from the AUC, and we'll touch on that in a second. So, paramilitary groups essentially originated from civilian self-defense forces. In the 1960s, Plan Lazo was a collaboration between the US government and the Colombian government to basically stem the flow of communism and the emergence of communism within the country. In 1994, the government officially adopted the Integrated Rural Security Plan, which formalized the use of civilian networks for gathering intelligence and actively defending their communities against left-wing groups. In that, the Convivir program was in Antioquia. That was started by Alvaro Uribe, who is one of the founders of the current Democratic Center Party within the country. So these groups went through an official demobilization program in 2003 to 2006. There's official law, the Justice and Peace Law, which was created to oversee the demobilization of these groups. And many members from Convivir and from these civilian defense groups flowed into the creation of the AUC, which was one of the primary paramilitary groups fighting against FARC and these other left-wing groups at the time. So the demobilization program was seen as ineffective in many ways. Over 500 mid-level commanders did not participate, and the majority dropped out in the process. Of probably 4,500 leaders who participated, only 228 ended in a full confession as intended. By 2009, the National Police, so this is 3 years after the demobilization program, the National Police estimated 4,000 members of illegal armed groups had a presence in over 173 municipalities. Human Rights Watch in 2010 estimated that the number of these combatants was as high as 10,000. State reports from the government between 2006 and 2010 reported that 87% of captured or killed members of these paramilitary groups, there were 10,000 in total, had come from these former paramilitary groups. So essentially, the civilian defense forces led into the paramilitary groups, which were demobilized, but then essentially rebranded immediately after. Does that check out?
Yeah, I mean, basically the paramilitaries were these state-sponsored units, and many times they worked together. According to the Center of Memory and Reconciliation, they're responsible for the greatest number of human rights violations in the Colombian Civil War. And the peace process, the justice and peace law was very flawed. A lot of ex-combatants didn't follow through with the process and just ended up forming new groups, and kind of they just swept it under the rug, saying that the AUC didn't exist anymore, when in reality they just morphed into not so much a standing army, but more like a narco hit army.
So one of the things in the conflict is this idea of a simplified narrative of good versus bad, evil, and the righteous. So media has played a huge role in framing this conflict. The media environment in Colombia is predominantly based in urban centers. Two of the largest media stations in Colombia are owned by very powerful families. So this has created a trickle-down effect, so that here in the United States and in other countries, we tend to only see what's pushed out by the larger stations in that country, and we see that in other conflicts in the world as well. So as Nico was saying, the Center for Historical Memory, between 1980 and 2006, paramilitaries were found to be responsible for the majority of atrocities. This is a government-sanctioned group that did reports and truth-finding missions within Colombia. So I'm going to go faster. So Ituango is, as we said, in the northwest of the country in rural Antioquia. It's recently part of a large hydro project. 47% of the municipality has electricity, half has access to drinking water, only 4% has mobile phone coverage. It's demonstrative of the conflict in many ways, and it's a great, not great, but it's a suitable place to look at to examine what's happening now because of these factors. High levels of registered victims. About 2/3 of the inhabitants are registered as victims of the conflict. There have been previous paramilitary, like highly publicized paramilitary incursions into the area that distrust of central and regional authorities. High levels of illicit crop production, weak state institutions. And also within the country, it has one of the highest levels of extrajudicial killings by security forces.
That's pretty important. Like a practice that was very common by the military was that in the desire to produce results for Plan Colombia, which was a US-sponsored military assistance plan, the government would kill civilians and dress them up as guerrillas and present them as guerrillas killed in combat. And there's roughly, I think, 3,000, possibly more of those cases registered.
Probably in like the early 2000s. This is Ituango. Yeah, it's very mountainous. It's at the northern edge of the Andes, and it's the opening it connects several strategic areas. And so historically, various groups have fought over this territory, and specifically, this is like the main. They're trying to improve their tourism. This is kind of one of the main restaurants and stores and market areas.
It's like the boardwalk.
Yeah, the boardwalk. Yeah. So Santa Lucia is where we were with the demobilization. This is where they created the camp. It was connected to the electrical grid 8 years ago. Generally undeveloped, pretty representative of much of rural Colombia. 2000, in a reciprocal attack for an incursion a year before, it was burned to the ground by paramilitaries. Residents have consistently been displaced. This is kind of, I just want to show you guys this as kind of to demonstrate what the infrastructure is like in these areas. So this is during coffee season. Families need to ride on top. This is basically the only way for coffee farmers in this area to get their product to market, is to load up civilian transport, pretty much to the brim. Roads are very poor. These get stuck all the time. There's landslides. So this is going to one of the camps. So our work, I'm gonna fly through this to give us time to actually talk more about the conflict. But when I was there with Nico, we did several projects. We did a community photography workshop of actually teaching photography to several groups of the 18th Front, a few members, and then working with the community that they would demobilize into and teaching youth in that community photography skills. And I was able to get a camera store in Portland to donate cameras to be in the community so they could continue to document their story after we left. This is their camp before the demobilization. This is after they'd come from the jungle. They were in these transitory zones temporarily.
Wait, who's the they? Who's camp?
Oh, this is the 18th Front. So the
FARC.
they is FARC. FARC, 18th Front of FARC.
So this is FARC, not the paramilitary.
This is FARC, yes, yes. The paramilitaries are much more clandestine and how would you describe, secretive?
Yeah, they operate a lot more in the shadows. I mean, something that really distinguishes the FARC is that they have, like, within their rules, they're not allowed, like, to cover their face. They're not allowed to cover their face. They're supposed to be proud that they're guerrillas. And so it's a lot more easier to, like, you know, and they're not there for money. None of these soldiers get paid. They're there because, you know, one reason or another they ended up there, but they don't get paid. Whereas opposed to paramilitaries, they operate in urban areas and they get paid money from the narco business, and so they are always either they cover their face or they're just very hard to access.
So originally they were paid by the government, they were state sponsored?
Originally they were formed mostly by rich landowners, and so they would kind of fund those movements as well as politicians and businesses. I mean, Chiquita Bananas, Coca-Cola, these are all big companies that have been documented as financially supporting these groups at one moment or another.
But that should be discreetly or openly?
It was discreetly, but like investigations have uncovered that they argue that it was because of extortions, that they were extorting the companies for money. But either one way or another, they were giving money to these paramilitary groups.
I was just thinking, like, can you just call them the paramilitary force? Like, I mean, that is generally the term which is used for the government finance something like.
Yeah, so like in India and Pakistan, for example,
Yes, like,
paramilitaries take on a much different role,
Yes.
right? They're actually officially part of the government.
Yes.
In Colombia, it was different, where they were seen as sort of a way for things to happen.
Okay.
You know, is that correct?
Yeah, there was always like a distance. They couldn't publicly acknowledge their cooperation with these paramilitary groups, but it was very evidently there. Basically, the paramilitaries would do all the dirty work that the Colombian government couldn't do.
So is there no registry of the identities of paramilitaries? They really weren't organized on a bureaucratic basis?
Well, back in the early 2090s, they were registered when they were like a standing army. Now they've morphed into a lot more like cartel type groups, where their focus is solely the drug business, illegal mining, gold mining, and territorial control. And these are groups that don't like to be shown. They like to maintain a low profile and.
But do the identity records of individual soldiers exist from when they were 10 years ago?
Absolutely.
There might be half as many, but they're still listed somewhere?
Yeah. From the peace process, from the justice and peace laws in the early 2000s, all that was documented. In Antioquia alone, I think the number is like 40% of those paramilitaries that demobilized have been killed. and most of them because they went back to armed groups. They went back to committing crimes and forming part of these residual groups. But a large number of them have been killed.
So we'll fly through these really quick. This is the tintype project. Essentially, it was using an old method of photography to create plates. Plates of the members. I'm going to fly through these so we can focus on what's happening now. Nico. So sent to Lucia. So the terms of the peace accord, as it was agreed upon, there were reparations for the victims, there were members of communities, there were women, there were members from the communities that had been involved in many of the attacks in creating the peace accord. HEP was created as a truth-seeking mechanism for transitional justice. Fighters were intended to demobilize and confess, and they were to be spared jail time and extradition. It was intended to prosecute 7,000 guerrillas, up to 24,000 state officials, and up to and including over 12,000 civilians accused of financing these different groups and various parties. And so one of the reasons FARC agreed to this is because it was going to take an inclusive look at every party within the conflict. I think Nico will speak about this more, but it's since been stripped of many of these provisions and focused strictly on FARC as a single entity.
This is like March 2016.
It was November 2016 was ratified. I'll get to the peace vote in October, but this was...
The peace vote was in October 2016, and the vote lost. The peace accord lost. Colombian people said they didn't want the peace accords by a very slim margin. And then it was finally ratified through Congress in December. So like the president pushed it through anyway, but through Congress.
So other terms of the peace accord, the social and economic reintegration program for former combatants, so productive projects that would allow people to put down their arms and do job training and basically reintegrate back into society in this highly polarized.
You mean both paramilitaries and FARC?
FARC primarily, but were there other stipulations for?
What's that? I'm sorry, I didn't get
Would the paramilitaries be part of the social economic reintegration?
No, the social economic reintegration was for ex-FARC,
Just FARC?
as well as rural communities
Okay.
in the area of influence.
And the truth-seeking mechanism?
What's that?
And the truth-seeking mechanism?
The truth-seeking mechanism was the transitional justice was meant to be for businessmen, politicians, ex-FARC, and military members.
But not
Not
paramilitary?
paramilitary.
Paramilitary members could ask to be included, and it would be up to the decisions of the courts. But I mean, considering that the benefits under this transitional justice was a lot better than what they negotiated in early 2000s, several have expressed interest in participating in this transitional justice because they say that if you tell the truth and the whole truth, then you pretty much get off.
But what I know about this mechanism is that in order to benefit from it, it has to be from groups that have political activity, violent political activity. But they need a political goal. If they transition from being an anti-guerrilla group to a criminal group, I think they lose this qualification.
Right. I mean, in fact, currently, or at least a couple months ago, the government was trying to negotiate with the new neo-paramilitary groups, which is AGC, which evolved from the AUC, to kind of negotiate their basically handing over to the government. But the HEP mostly focuses is on, you're right, they won't include the current paramilitaries that are currently operating, but they will include the paramilitaries that demobilized in the 2000s, which had very strong political ideology.
Another part of the peace accord was coca crop substitution programs. So between 1960 and 1980, coffee prices dropped because of a glut in the global market, down to almost $2 a kilo or pound. It was very low, and so it was unsustainable farmers chose to produce coca under FARC. And so the coca crop substitution program was meant to be implemented within the rural communities to provide a new form of living and to peacefully transition into new crops, into new opportunities for the farmers. Most importantly was to establish a military presence in these previously held areas to avoid the creation of a power vacuum, as we've seen. Land restitution, which is kind of at the core of this conflict as far as settling this informal land tenure and giving people access giving people access to formal land titles, and transitioning FARC into a political party. Was there anything else in the peace accord? So the no vote, there's a large campaign, 30 companies spent $1.3 billion to focus on outrage amongst civilians with the conflict. It's much easier to promote outrage and anger rather than to explain the intricacies of this peace process, which the other side had to do. So it was a low voter turnout, as we saw with Brexit, as we saw with our presidential election, very small margin, but it turned out against. A large split in rural versus urban votes. People in rural areas typically voted for the peace process.
Against the peace process. In urban areas, they voted against.
Yeah, in urban areas against the peace process, in rural areas for the peace process. So social media was widely utilized to get people out to publicly engage in the social space for the no campaign in urban spaces.
It was quite surprising because after the no vote won, the campaign manager of the no vote, which was part of the Centro Democrático, which is the current governing party, he came out saying like, yeah, we basically lied and we based our campaign on deceits and playing with people's emotions. Like he very openly admitted to just, running a very dirty campaign. And then eventually he was like sanctioned by the party for saying it.
So the process, 7,000 guerrillas moving to 26 UN camps. This is February 2017, February 1st. Disarming with time, going through social and economic reintegration programs, coping with trauma, all in the presence of paramilitary groups. So these are images from the 18th Front when we were with them as they moved.
That guy in the background was killed about 2-3 weeks ago by paramilitary.
This is coming down from the camp. You see the UN monitors, you see the Colombian National Government monitors. They loaded up in the civilian chivas. Yeah.
These are the what is this?
FARC, and that's a valid question because there's so many, like it says, a kaleidoscopic conflict, and there's so many parties. But this is FARC. This is the focus of the peace accords. So they loaded everything they had, drove through, and this is the camp that they arrived to. So across Colombia, the creation of the camps, the building of the camps was poorly implemented. Many of these fronts moved into an area that literally had a bunch of bags of concrete and no foundations for buildings, nothing developed. So it was kind of an ominous step for them into the peace process from the beginning.
They expected to come down from their jungle camps and find these UN monitored camps already set up and start integrating back into civilian life, and that's what they found. So.
And they lived you can see the tents on the right there, that's where they were living.
For 3-4 months they were living out of tents.
So this is from a year ago. These were kind of the recommendations then. It's to keep the HEP mechanism intact as it was created, which it has been stripped of a lot of its power and now it only focuses on the guerrillas. Create more processes for urban-rural communication for people to understand what the issues are, to create more informal networks of people that can bridge both spaces. Strengthen municipality and rural journalism to help communicate better what's happening in these areas. Develop community policing in rural sectors. Traditionally, police, because of the conflict, has been highly militarized, and because of that, it's not personal, it's not community-based, and so that creates a lot of issues with rebuilding trust when the state has often been seen as working parallel with a lot of these paramilitary groups that have performed a lot of atrocities within these communities. And then most importantly, addressing the economic issues and lack of development and focusing on reform. So they transitioned to a political party. I'll let Nico talk more about this. I want to get through this too. Nico time. So this was when I was there last. So one of the militia commanders, this is right outside of the transition zone. You can literally see the tents where they're staying right here. So it's a disarmament zone, there's no weapons. And overnight someone came and kicked down the door on the end there and killed the militia commander.
This was the first ex-combatant to be killed.
And 7 have been killed since from the 18th Front.
So these are former FARC?
Yeah, who've gone along with the peace process, laid down all their weapons,
Right. And who's
and are
killing
living. They believed it might have been a personal grievance, but they believe it was connected to
FARC.
These are former FARC members, but I don't know what happened from it. I mean,
the thing is that out of the 60 plus homicides that have occurred this year in Ituango, which is a huge spike from 2 years ago, which only registered 8, only 1 case has been resolved. So nobody really knows formally like who's killing everyone, but I mean, the paramilitaries are number 1, yes. This guy in particular he was a militia commander, so he was the one in charge of like killing civilians on behalf of the guerrillas. So he also had a lot of enemies. So it could have also been like a personal grievance. But.
So, and then it's not only the former combatants, it's their family members. 6 have been killed since the peace process began. And within the Ituango municipality, 600 to 700 civilians have registered as displaced, which means there are more that have been displaced from that number.
And what makes this, you can understand that, obviously people wanted to kill this guy, but what makes it hard to believe is this is within the transitory zone, a UN monitored transitory zone. These areas are supposed to be safe for these people to reintegrate back into society. So when he's killed a month, I think it was, a month or 2 months after they moved to the transitory zone, that immediately starts ringing a lot of bells to the to the other part of guerrilla.
So, a statistic from March, 55% of the rebels have left the zones. This doesn't mean they're becoming dissidents. It means they moved to another city, perhaps for economic opportunities. They might have family they're reuniting with. There's no motivation to stay in the camps. There's essentially nothing happening. The productive economic programs haven't been implemented. I think within Colombia, Nico, you told me 88 people are formally.
Yeah, within the first 2 years were very critical in the peace process. Everyone said that from the beginning, and we're nearing the end of the first 2 years, because there was a window of opportunity where if implemented well, the peace process could work. One of the first things that had to happen was that the government had to finance productive projects for ex-combatants to actually be able to make a living. As to date, only 87 ex-combatants have been formally involved in productive projects financed by the state.
Out of 7,000?
Out of 7,000.
So of these members, only 80% have finished. 80% have not finished high school. Education is a huge priority. They're given a $230 monthly stipend. So these emerging dissident groups are actually, they need people with particular skill sets. And so these former combatants are the ideal pool to recruit from. And so the Gulf Cartel, those Bocelli, these other organizations are recruiting people, offering more than what they're receiving, and people are able to use the skills that they've developed, unfortunately, through the conflict. So we've seen the 36th Front. There was a small dissident group that emerged in 2006 with 8 members. Today it's at about 100 plus members, and Nico can speak more to that in a second. It's so essentially for civilians, the conflict, these essentially a day or 2 after they moved into this camp. Nico could talk about this more too. John, we interviewed John, and he was saying that there are already groups of masked men coming in and telling civilians that there's a new boss in town, and that they're essentially under new government in a way, like days after in February that they moved into the camps. And so they're extorted, they have to pay to these competing factions that are now in these areas. Over 60, as Nico said, 60 people have been murdered there, up from 8 in 2016. That makes it 5 times as deadly as El Salvador, Ituango, in this case. So I'm gonna just jump through and pass it off to Nico here.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. Thank you for Zach for inviting me. So yeah, I mean, I graduated from George Washington and I decided to move to Colombia. My father's displaced from a town called San Carlos, which is Antioquia, which is one of the municipalities that suffered the most in the 90s and the 80s at the height of the armed conflict. And so I kind of wanted to learn more about my family's experience and also my studied conflict and security, so I wanted to see firsthand what this peace process was. So I decided to move to Ituango, which is, that little town in the middle of the Andes, 7 hours away from Medellin, which is the closest city. When I first got there, the FARC were still in control, they were still negotiating. And just to leave this town, just to leave anywhere of this town, to head to this mountain or that mountain or any other mountain, you had to ask for permission from the FARC. And when I got there, I didn't know FARC. So it was, very tense. The plaza, it had military bunkers everywhere. The town had been taken like 6 or 7 times in its history by the FARC guerrillas. There was a huge military complex right in the town, in the center of town. The military had taken the only institution of higher learning as a base, so the town was left without any higher learning. And so I moved there in end of 2015, mid 2015. So I chose Ituango, number one, because of the peace process, because Ituango, unlike many other regions in the country, was solely dominated by the FARC. It's one of 2 places in the country where the paramilitaries tried to advance and take over, but were pushed back and ultimately defeated. Everywhere else in the country, the paramilitaries basically wiped off any FARC or collaborators off the map. And also because there is the most ambitious and largest hydroelectric project in the country, and I think under construction in Latin America right now. And what do we see here? We see obviously a history of where the government attempts to undertake these mega projects tend to attract a lot of attention. Since it was a region controlled by the FARC in the early 2000s, there was a huge paramilitary offensive to try and secure the area and to build this hydro dam. So here we see 2 functionaries of the hydro dam displacing this rural peasant family. And while they're displacing this family, this farmer blasts on his stereo while they're displacing him FARC music, like FARC propaganda music. This is the hydro dam. It's diverting the 2nd biggest river in Colombia. This was early in its construction. This is Santa Lucia. This is where the current UN monitored transitory camp is. It's about an hour and a half from the small town that I showed you. And this was a march in 2016 in support of the peace process. I mean, it's quite sad because, I mean, when I first got there and with the development of the peace process, you just felt the hope in the air, the hope and that desire for things to change. There was no one in this entire community that didn't go to this march. Everyone was there. And now it's just complete despair. no one holds any faith in this peace process anymore. So it's been very sad to kind of see that transition, like that change of, like, you know, a lot of hope to the current blood that's being spilled everywhere. This was during the peace process, 2016 as well. This is the current commander of the FARC dissidents. So he ends up eventually leaving the peace process and forming this dissident group. He was a very quiet man, very smart, despite only receiving 4 months of formal education when he was 10 years old. Very politically formed, has that, like, you know, Marxist ideology, and he decides to, when they kill Molina, which is the picture that Zach showed, he says, all right, they're gonna start killing us like crazy, I'm gonna head back to the jungle. And so he starts maturing that idea of all right, how do I get weapons? How do I start recruiting? He begins recruiting within the camp, talking the situation with other ex-combatants. And at the end of 2017, he finally leaves the process and formally creates the 18th Front Dissidents. But he gave peace a chance. He was in the UN monitored transitory camp for about 6-7 months before he's finally separated. Obviously, coca is a big fuel of the peace process, of the conflict in Colombia. The UNODC last month released a report on coca production in Colombia and registered an all-time high throughout the country. And that's mostly accredited to, one, people want to get more benefits from the coca crop substitution programs, and two, the paramilitaries have begun to take over the areas that the FARC controlled and have been telling farmers to grow more. The FARC before had quotas on how much coca would be produced in a certain region, and with them retreating from the territories, the paramilitaries come in and just tell the farmers, grow. And this picture, I'm going to try and tell this story through characters, right? Through my time there, I was able to befriend this man right here. His name's Christian. He was one of the 4 or 5 leaders, of the front, of the entire front. The 18th Front is also, on a side note, was considered one of the most militarily successful FARC fronts in the entire country. And he is the youngest commander. He's 28. He's the youngest commander to hold that rank because he was so prepared and had a lot of military success. So what do we have here? This was taken in 2016. Today, this man is working with the FARC political party in Bogota. He's in charge of the very hard task of security for ex-combatants. So he's in charge of, like, you know, providing bodyguards for people who decide to go into politics and just ensure that the ex-combatants aren't getting killed. So he's a top dog in the political party now. She is his sister. She was an FARC. She was also a FARC combatant, but she demobilized individually back in like 2015, 2014. She basically left the FARC. Deserted. And there was this government program that provides people who desert the guerrillas with benefits and reintegration into society. And so she participated in that program, cut off communications with basically these two, which were her brothers, disowned her because she had left the FARC, and basically anyone who went into that program was considered as betraying the movement. The peace process allowed them to reconnect. It was a very beautiful moment. This is Pacho, which is was her husband. And he is now a dissident. He is one of the commanding dissidents of the 18th Front. She is currently working with a government agency called, which is the same government agency that manages the reintegration of ex-combatants. So she's now working for that agency. And this is her brother, and he's pretty much illiterate, or like very low studies, and he decided to go far away from Ituango because there they would kill him. And he started a little farm with his son that was recently born thanks to the peace process. So it's like in one family you see all the different paths that can be taken from the peace, from like what evolved from the peace process. And yeah, I mean, this is him again. This is Pacho. I got to know him very well. And why does he join the dissidents? He was madly in love with her when she deserted the FARC. He was also ex-FARC, and he also deserted when she deserted because he wanted to follow her anywhere. So he deserted and also went to this government agency program of reintegration in 2015 and spent years in civilian life trying to start a business with his wife and their children. But he always kind of loved that life of that guerrilla life, that camaraderie and all that. And he reflects on that a lot. He says, during my time as a civilian, I was always thinking about my time in the jungle and with the movement and fighting for the people and all that. She ends up leaving him for a 19-year-old. And so at that moment, he says, screw it, I'm going to the jungle. So a lot of these, going back into the jungle is also, it's very emotional. Dissidents I've talked to, one's left because the paramilitary sent a woman, for example, to infiltrate the UN monitored camp and get intelligence. And to do so, she ends up making an ex-combatant fall in love with her. The ex-combatant was at this point working as a bodyguard because under the peace accord, the FARC present some of their fighters to be trained as bodyguards and provide security for the people that go into politics. And this comes from because when, as Zach was saying, when they were Unión Patriótica, their first political movement back in the 80s, a lot of them were killed off, even by the state-provided bodyguards. So under this peace accord, they said, all right, we're going to provide our own bodyguards. And so this particular man was one of those. He had a stable job. He was carrying a gun. But when he learns that the woman he loved was a AUC sent spy, he also decides to go to the jungle and seek to kill this paramilitary. So a lot of this conflict, and it's not so much ideological as it is, just emotions and basic instincts. This was the same guy that we saw earlier in the picture. This is Christian. He right now is in charge of one of the most difficult areas in Colombia, which is the south of the country, where a lot of FARC members are being killed off right now. So he is very stressed out at the moment, trying to deal with that. There's another ex-combatant. His name's Lennon. He was recently displaced. About 3 weeks ago, the paramilitaries in Ituango launched a massive assault to try and push these dissident factions out. And he was displaced as a result. This was in happier times, early in the peace process.
So the dissidents are people who've gone back to being FARC.
To being guerrilla.
To being guerrillas.
Yeah.
And So why isn't the government, why are the paramilitaries combating them? Why wouldn't it be the government?
Well, the thing is that the dissident factions, on February 1st, 2016, the FARC as a guerrilla group all collectively moved to the UN transitory zones. Immediately, like about a week after everyone in town starts hearing reports that paramilitaries are starting to take over the territories, that they're moving up in boats of 20 men, fully armed, camouflage.
They're filling the vacuum.
Right, they're filling the vacuum. The dissidents primarily result as a response to that. So, I mean, we're talking about an area that for the last 30 years has been a hegemony of FARC, and that they fought and sweat for years. And so to see the paramilitaries walk in like nothing, like really, really bothered them. And especially when they start killing off former ex-combatants, like their friends and this and that. So yeah, I mean, the FARC dissidents form with the sole expressed desire to push these paramilitaries out of the municipality. How does the government play into all of this? In the peace accords, it is said that the government has to create special units to combat paramilitarism, like effectively combat paramilitarism. Because, I mean, paramilitarism has existed for the last 30, 40 decades in Colombia, and the government hasn't done much of anything. Even now, today, like, most of the country is controlled is by paramilitaries. And so the government doesn't necessarily effectively fight these paramilitaries. And they're only interested in like that kind of what Zach talked about, that media narrative of like that the FARC are the only bad guys in the country and that the government only has to combat them. So what happened? In Ituango, for that 1 year after the FARC moved to the transitory camps, there was about 1 year, 8 months to 1 year where there was no necessarily dissident faction formed. It was just paramilitaries and the government with their security forces. During that 1 year, not a single effective operation against the paramilitaries was implemented. In fact, in Santa Rita, which is a rural area of Ituango, there was the paramilitary commander walked into the police station and said hello to the commander and like best friends and just walked out again. About 2 months later, he was captured, but he was let go that same day. And even, I think about 2 months ago, the governor came to Ituango because at this point the security situation was getting so bad, and he replaced all of the police in the municipality because of their collaboration with the paramilitary groups.
Do you think the paramilitary groups have any kind of support among the population or specific parts of the population?
In Ituango, no. I think their support is very little. What they do is that they're the only armed group offering 1,800,000 pesos to anyone that wants to join them. The dissidents aren't doing that because they don't pay their troops.
How much is that? How much is that?
That is like $600, which in rural Colombia is a lot of money.
To join the paramilitary?
Yeah. So it's not like they have support, they're buying support. That's what they're doing.
Because you mentioned that during the campaign for the peace process, the arguments of the no part was that it wasn't fair, it was about justice, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking, what would be the motivations or interests of parties to the conflict to not have a peace agreement? So obviously it's money, crime, money?
And I think a lot of it has to do with the truth. Because like we said, I mean, a lot of the human rights violations have been committed by these paramilitary groups, which have been aligned historically with politicians and businessmen. Sectors of society with a lot of power and continued influence. So, I mean, when you're gonna say no to the peace process, I mean, you know, why? Like, I mean, why? What kind of country says no to a negotiated peace between two parties, right? And you know, the campaign was run on lies, a lot of it. Like, I mean, they were saying that the government was going to pay each ex-combatant a ridiculous amount of money, which wasn't true, that they weren't going to go to jail and get scot-free, you know, all this stuff.
It's Santos. Kind of doing that at all.
His predecessor, Uribe.
Uribe.
Was the one.
Wait, did Uribe sponsor Santos?
Yeah. So then they had that was a big thing, because when Santos begins negotiating with the guerrillas, like, that was basically like deviating from his line of governance, and he started then to regard Santos as a traitor, because Santos was his protege. He was his defense minister. In fact, Santos was the defense minister when the government was most implicated in false positive scandals, which was when they dress up civilians as guerrillas and kill them.
Nico, is it okay if we move on to the Q&A? I know some of you guys already started to asking questions, but we are past the time, and